Okay, everyone, as I told you the other day, we're going to try to finish up this chapter and review. Just a reminder, your third test is coming up. So, where I'm at in the book, if you're following in the book, is page 278, section 4, The Changing Family in a Changing Society. And on my PowerPoints, I'm on the screen that shows divorced families. So, we're going to move into probably the biggest section of the chapter and maybe the most questions, and just helpful hint for the test. The three big areas are going to be this section I'm about to cover. Any questions on conflict between parents and adolescents, spouses and siblings, and then the parenting styles of Diana Baumrind. Those are your three big areas. So when we're looking at the changing family, we're talking about the complex social network of these families and how families have changed over the years. Well, and when we talk about divorce, then of course, I think most people know that the divorce rate increased quite a bit, starting in around the 60s. So just a few facts and maybe put a check mark by that first paragraph. It's worth your time to read it. There's a lot of information in there. But basically, we have the highest divorce rate in the industrialized world here in America. And according to statistics, the divorce rate in America is 50%. So one out of every two marriages ends up in divorce. And even that number is not very accurate because there's also a trend in America where people aren't even getting married in the first place and they're just living together. And those couples also sometimes go their separate ways, but that's not even counted as a divorce, but it still has the same impact, or it could, when there's children involved. So a lot of the problems that I talk about related to divorce and the aftermath of divorce, just keep in mind that a lot of times the problems uh, are compounded by the fact that there are children, and the children also have to be factored in, and the adjustments they have to make. So the next statement in my PowerPoint talks about by age 18, 25% of kids in America will have spent a portion of their life with a step parent in their life. So be real careful in this part of the test because there's a difference between that statement and how many kids will experience their parents' divorce. And so we'll go through some of these numbers. So the trends or secular trends, remember a trend is a pattern of change over time. So the secular trend related to divorce, the divorce rate shot up in the 60s and the 70s, and then according to statistics leveled out in the 80s. But again, that's not necessarily an accurate number since they don't factor in. The only way they can count divorces is through the court systems where a divorce has been declared. And so that's the numbers they use. Uh, the, uh, the percentage at the bottom is of that screen. It says 40% of kids will experience their parents' divorce. So that's different than the 25% will have a step family at some point in their life by the time they're 18. Because sometimes these kids, this 40%, their parents don't remarry. And we will look at that single parent following marriage and how long and what average length of time and the problems associated with it. Well, the adjustments that kids have to make following a divorce on the next screen here. Be real careful with this one. It says generally, kids from divorced homes show poorer adjustments than kids from intact or non-divorced families. And then it has this long list of adjustments kids have to make. And they could be struggling in school because they're distracted by what's going on at home. They can be acting out, anger problems. They could be experiencing depression. They could involve themselves into unhealthy relationships, seeking attention from others, substance abuse, and all sorts of things. But here's the thing. that doesn't mean every kid that goes through a divorce is going to turn to these things and use these as their coping mechanisms. It just means they're at higher risk of uh, experiencing some of these things than are kids from non-divorced homes. And so just keep that in mind. Maybe the best statement to put a check mark by, it says that this represents a smaller portion of kids than we might think. And so while generally when you compare the two, the divorce to the intact or the non-divorce, yeah, they are at higher risk, but generally speaking, it's really a small percentage, and it doesn't mean that that's going to go on indefinitely, what we'd call long-term negative effects. What it means is that there's going to be some period of adjustment, and then kids are pretty resilient, and they're going to make those adjustments and do what they need to do and get on with their lives, whatever the new life family situation is. Now, uh, the uh, the next few pages get into some studies and research regarding those problems kids might have and how parents should handle and what people could expect. And so I'm on the screen now of adolescent adjustment in divorced homes. So what they're talking about here is the model in which they're looking at all these different factors and how kids manage their way through these things and what parents should be doing. So some of the studies we're going to look at begin on page 282, should parents stay together for the sake of the kids? So this is a common question that people have about that the difficulties for kids is so bad that parents should just stay together no matter what. Well, that's not such an easy answer. Go back to prolonged intense conflict that I covered with you on another presentation. If kids are in a hostile environment, if there's violence, if there's abuse and drugs and all sorts of things that could be even more harmful, no, it would be better for those people to separate and get out of that situation, because that's doing more harm than the divorce would do. But on the other hand, the author says, well, if, and that's a big if the parents can remain civil and put their differences aside, whatever the reason they're getting a divorce, and maintain some sort of civility and continue to parent effectively the authoritative style, and even if they decide, okay, when the kids are grown and gone, then we're going to get a divorce, then yeah, it probably would be better to stay together and finish up what they began as far as raising these kids into independent young adults. And so that's really what that study's all about. Let's move on here. I know I'm moving a little bit quickly, but I really want to try to get this in for you so we can do a review for the upcoming test. All right. So I'm looking now at factors involved in the individual adolescent risk vulnerability. So here's a couple of studies here. One is about personality and temperament. And basically what they're talking about is there are some personality types that are going to struggle with their parents' divorce, and certainly some temperament types. Basically, there's 3 temperament types: easy, difficult, and slow to warm up. And an easy temperament type kid is going to be a person who's going to make the necessary adjustments, but a difficult temperament type, they really struggle and could have long-term negative effects from this. When it comes to personality, when you do personality inventories, what they find is that kids who are high-risk type of kids, they're easily bored, they need a lot of excitement, they're impulsive, they don't adjust very well to their parents' divorce. They overreact and therefore fall into some of the adjustment issues I mentioned in an earlier screen. Another major factor that there's a study about is, well, what about the age of the child at the time of the divorce? Does it make any difference? And what they find is, yeah, it makes a big difference, uh, the age of the kids when the parents decide to get the divorce. And while there's lots of research on this, the one that the author focuses on, and again for time's sake here, I'm going to focus on that one only, and that is that the most detrimental time for people to get a divorce is when their kids are at that preschool age, these little 4 and 5 year old kids. And there's many reasons, and all kids suffer some level of trauma and depression and anger and all the things we talked about. But these kids are especially vulnerable. Mainly, the author is saying anyway in the research, is that they tend to blame themselves because they really don't understand why their parents are having to do this, and so they want to fix it, and they think maybe somehow it was their fault because they fought too much with their brother and their sister, and their parents were having to fuss at them a lot, and it just wore them out, and somehow they want to promise to do good, and then when that doesn't happen, these kids are very frustrated. And the problem with that then is that small children can still somewhat be managed fairly easily by a parent, but as they move into early adolescence, which is already a difficult time, then it begins to come out a little more, and the effects of the divorce and the impact it had on them over a long-term effect for those kids. And so you're going to definitely see some more serious issues with that population. Uh, and then the other problem is that the average time between a divorce and remarriage is approximately 4 years before people remarry. And and here's the dilemma there, is that the worst time for people to remarry and have a step family is when kids are entering early adolescence. And so the exact time they get a divorce, so it's almost a double negative impact. First they experience a divorce, then they stabilize over the next few years, and then once they're stabilized, then they have a step family situation coming at them during early adolescence. So I'm going to cover that in a later uh, presentation part of this chapter, but just keep that in mind. Now, as far as how long does it take the family as a unit to adjust to the divorce, on average, research says about 1 year. The first year following a divorce is the most difficult. Let me say it that way. That's probably a better way to say it. So there are all those issues of maybe grades dropping, some anger outbursts, depression, and that whole list that I gave you. You're going to see those probably in that first year following a divorce. By the second year, according to research, most people are going to start settling back down and getting into their new life system with the family and whatever arrangements have been made regarding custody and visitations and finances and all of those things, and things start to improve somewhat. So the first year following a divorce is most difficult as far as adjustments for everyone, and that includes the parents because they're also having to make major adjustments, and the kids. Uh, Custody, factors involved in individual adolescent risk vulnerability is where I'm at, so just so you can kind of keep up with your PowerPoint. And custody issues can be quite a problem, and people spend a lot of time in court over custody. The trend, of course, is to avoid court and go to arbitration and try to work these things out that's agreeable to both parties, so that both parties remain responsible for the welfare of their kids. And so the most common thing that's going on today is joint custody. But in spite of that, the most common thing that occurs, and make sure you understand the word domiciliary rights, the domiciliary parent, or what the author calls the custodial parent, 75% of the time is going to be mom. And the reason they do that is because typically they want to leave the kids in the home in which they've been living, and so typically mom stays in the home. And again, the reason for that is not to make the kids have to move, to relocate, to go to a different school. a whole change of environment for their friends and so on. So they're already struggling, and so if they can keep them in their home, that makes things a little easier for the kids, and so that's pretty much why they do that. Now, uh, I'm not going to cover the study on uh, boys should stay with their dads and girls should stay with their moms, because that to me is not a good criteria to make a determination as to who should have domiciliary rights. I think the parent who's best prepared and able, uh, based on the parenting style and so on, should be the one. And then the other parent would be the visitation parent. Uh, the word relocation, circle it, put a star by it. If you have any scenario in which the kid has to relocate, that's going to be the worst case scenario. Because again, they may have plans, they may be in their senior year of high school, and now they're looking at having to move, and it disrupts their entire, their social circle, and all the things they're looking forward to. And so relocation is a major negative factor for these kids. Socioeconomic status, which is on page 283. Some of the what I just covered with you is on 282 and 283. I'm at the bottom of 283 now. Socioeconomic status, uh, the finances following a divorce. Again, generally speaking, what they find is the wife's income drops dramatically, sometimes as much as 25 to 50% of the previous household income. So if the family's been operating at a certain income level with both spouses bringing money in, and then there's a divorce, typically, and again, this is just a general statement, but generally speaking, the husbands were the primary provider as far as the percentage of that income, and the wives were the income was a little less. And so when the divorce occurs, then the moms, if you will, get hit harder on the financial. And not only that, but if they're still living in the home and they have domiciliary rights or custodial rights, and that means they're having to deal with the expenses of the home, maintaining the home, still taking care of the kids, and so on. And if the father has relocated, could possibly get by with a small apartment, less expensive, and only paying child support, and typically is not going to cover all the expenses. So the answer there is that the moms are going to take a much more serious hit financially when it comes to the money following divorce. And again, that's amplified, if you will, because of having kids. And so that's a real issue. And so you say, well, what's the problem for the kids? Well, the problem for the kids is they got used to a certain level of income and living at a certain standard of living. And when this occurs, that changes. And they still turn to mom, for instance, to pay and buy and provide the same things they had before. And when she says, I can't afford it, ask maybe dad, and dad tells the kids, well, I give your mom money for you. Well, all the kid just heard was, where's that money? I didn't get that money. And so they don't realize it's supposed to go for their health insurance, rent, light bill, food, and so they just think it's their money. So that creates some conflict, or could. And by the way, when we talk about conflict, you have pre-divorce conflict and post-divorce conflict, and most people think, okay, I'll get a divorce, I'm done with the problems with this person that I'm divorcing. But post-divorce conflict can create quite a few issues for these kids, because it means that their parents are continue to fight. And so I'll just take this minute to tell you that's one of the worst things you can do, is just stop the post-divorce conflict, because it's going to take even longer for these kids to adjust to their divorce, their parents' divorce. And so you really need to put that aside. Well, we move from, like I said earlier, people go on average of 4 years. They adjust to the new family system, single mom, kids maybe divide up the work. Mom may have to go on full time or go back to school, and whatever the situation is, and then things are going along okay again, the best that they can do under their circumstances, and then remarry. So once there's a remarriage, then you're talking about a step family situation. So uh, the problem with that is, what people don't anticipate is when you have a step family, it takes even longer for the kids to adjust than it did for them to adjust to the divorce. Uh, on average, they say 3 to 5 years. So we're going to be looking at that too, and the impact of that. Well, here's another number, a statistic for you that says 50% of kids from divorced homes will have a stepfather within 4 years. Now that's different than the first number I told you. 25% of kids will, by age 18, will possibly live some portion of their life with a step parent. But this specific, because see, maybe you have a step parent and there was never a divorce, and mom got married, now you have a step parent, which, by the way, is the most common, is having a stepfather. But this says 50% of kids whose homes did experience a divorce, they'll have a stepfather within 4 years. Now, we would assume that someone who's gone through a divorce would learn from that, make the necessary adjustments, make better choices, if you will, however you want to say it, and that the second time marriage, the divorce rate would actually go down. But that's not what statistics show. If there's been a divorce, then the divorce rate among those second-time marriages actually increases, and by 10%. So if the divorce rate was 50%, it goes to 60%. And this is especially true in families in which there are kids involved and step families involved, because you have ex-spouses you have to deal with. And so it does make it more difficult for the second family to make these adjustments. And so again, just keep that in mind. I'm going to try to get one more thing in for you, and I'll stop so we don't go too far over, and then I'll wrap it up and do a review for you on the next presentation. But when I said that 75% of the time mom gets domiciliary or custodial rights, the other thing about that is that 75% of the time, these kids are going to, when there is a remarriage, they're going to experience a stepfather. So when you're asked a question about structure type of step family, structure type is very specific. There's only 3 structure types. There's a stepfather, stepmother, or blended. The most common is going to be stepfather, again, because of what I just said. 75% of the time, mom will stay in the home and maintain custodial rights or domiciliary rights. When she remarries, there's your stepfather situation. The opposite of that would be true, in which the father has domiciliary rights, remarries, and the wife comes into the situation. Obviously, that's stepmother. And then the most complicated and most likely to fail, or most difficult to make succeed, would be the blended, in which both parents bring children into the relationship and have to make adjustments. And so I really don't want to go too much longer, so I'll come back to that one, and I'll let you kind of digest this information.